Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life. I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities.
And I embrace that and I enjoy that change.
And all of it unfolding as the public watches only fragments. Carefully selected appearances, carefully managed statements, carefully controlled silence. But silence inside the palace is not emptiness. It is tension. It is negotiation. It is change happening without announcement. And as the Andrew scandal continues to cast its shadow, it acts like a catalyst that forces every internal disagreement into sharper focus. Every decision becomes urgent. Every alliance becomes meaningful. Every hesitation becomes noticeable. And through it all, William's position becomes more defined, not as a future possibility, but as an active force within the present structure of monarchy, which leads to the question no one inside the palace has allowed, but everyone understands. How long can a system exist in two states at once? 1 foot in tradition, 1 foot in transformation, one monarch reigning, one heir already governing. The answer is not written in protocol. It is being written in real time, behind closed doors, in quiet meetings, in shifted responsibilities, in decisions that reshape an institution without ever announcing that it is being reshaped. And as the palace lights dim over London night after night, the reality becomes clearer. The monarchy is not waiting for change. It is already inside it. And the only thing left uncertain is how far that change will go before it becomes something irreversible. Because once power begins to move quietly, it rarely moves backward. It only moves forward. And forward, in this moment, belongs to a new generation standing just behind the throne, already learning how to use it. His approach, according to those familiar with his working style, mirrors a corporate structure more than a royal court. Clear roles, clear responsibilities, measurable outcomes, transparent communication pathways. To supporters, it represents modernization finally catching up with an ancient institution. To critics, it risks stripping the monarchy of its mystique and emotional identity. But to William, it is simple. If the monarchy cannot justify itself in modern terms, it cannot survive modern scrutiny. And nowhere is that belief more evident than in how the institution has responded to scandal. The Andrew situation became a defining test, not just of reputation, but of principle. William's position hardened as the crisis escalated. Any connection to individuals tied to reputational damage became, in his view, a liability that must be addressed decisively. No ambiguity, no partial distance, full separation. That stance reportedly placed him at odds with more traditional approaches within the family, where personal history and long-standing relationships are not easily discarded. And in that gap between principle and tradition, friction grew. Queen Camilla's relationship with certain long-standing personal connections became a point of contention in that wider debate. To William's camp, it represented unnecessary risk. To Camilla, it represented loyalty that predates royal titles and public scrutiny. Neither perspective was entirely willing to concede, and so the disagreement did not explode, it hardened, turning into distance, turning into strategy differences, turning into subtle but unmistakable shifts in influence. Meanwhile, Kate Middleton emerged as one of the most stabilizing forces in this evolving structure. Where William pushes for reform, Kate provides equilibrium. Where pressure rises, she absorbs it quietly. Where public perception wavers, she restores consistency. Her role has expanded beyond traditional expectations of a Princess of Wales. She is increasingly viewed internally as a strategic partner in managing the monarchy's public identity during one of its most fragile transitional periods in decades. Together, William and Kate represent a new model of royal leadership. Unified, disciplined, forward-facing. But even unity does not eliminate resistance. Because a monarchy is not just an institution. It is a collection of people shaped by decades of hierarchy, tradition, and emotional complexity. And those forces do not dissolve simply because a new generation is ready to take the lead. Inside the palace, King Charles remains central in title, but increasingly surrounded by shifting dynamics that place more operational weight on his heir. Every decision now carries an unspoken layer. Is this the king's direction, or the future king's expectation? And that ambiguity is where the modern monarchy now lives. Not in crisis, but in transition. A transition without a clear finish line. As months progress, insiders suggest that this shift is not slowing down. If anything, it is accelerating, because crises have a way of compressing time inside institutions built for longevity. What would normally take years begins to unfold in months. What would normally be gradual becomes immediate, and what would normally remain theoretical becomes operational reality. William's influence continues to expand not through formal declaration, but through necessity. The monarchy requires coordination. The monarchy requires clarity. The monarchy requires someone prepared to think beyond tradition and into survival. And increasingly, that responsibility falls to him. But every increase in responsibility creates another layer of tension. Between generations, between philosophies, between visions of what the crown should represent in a world that no longer treats institutions with automatic deference. And so the palace stands in a strange moment. A monarch on the throne, an heir already shaping the structure beneath him, a queen consort navigating loyalty and perception, and a princess of Wales quietly becoming one of the most influential stabilizing figures in the entire system. 4 roles, 4 pressures, one institution trying to remain unified under unprecedented strain. The world sees a monarchy built on ceremony, tradition, and unbroken continuity stretching back centuries. A crown passed from sovereign to sovereign like clockwork, predictable, controlled, untouchable. But inside Buckingham Palace, behind polished corridors and carefully staged appearances, something far less stable is unfolding. Not a ceremony, not a celebration, a transfer of power happening quietly, unevenly, and faster than the public has been told. And at the center of it all is a question that no one inside the royal household can fully avoid anymore. Is King Charles still the one in control, or has the future already begun to take over? It began with pressure that could no longer be contained. The renewed scandal surrounding Prince Andrew did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a wave. Old allegations resurfacing, new scrutiny building, public patience wearing thinner by the day. Every headline pushed the monarchy closer to a line it could not afford to cross. Because this time, it wasn't just about one individual. It became about the entire structure of royal accountability. And structures under pressure do one of two things. They hold, or they shift. Inside the palace, insiders describe the early signs of that shift as almost invisible at first. Adjusted schedules, changed briefing chains, a growing number of decisions quietly redirected toward Prince William's office rather than the traditional advisory path of the sovereign. At first, it was practical. King Charles was managing the demands of monarchy while also dealing with ongoing health challenges. The workload was immense, the pressure relentless, the expectation unchanged. So William stepped forward, not as a replacement, but as reinforcement. And that is where everything began to change. Because reinforcement in a monarchy does not stay temporary for long. It becomes structure, and structure becomes authority. As the scandal surrounding Andrew intensified, William's role expanded alongside it. He was no longer simply advising. He was shaping responses, coordinating strategy, defining boundaries around what the monarchy would and would not tolerate going forward. And those boundaries were becoming increasingly strict. To William, the crisis was not just reputational. It was existential. Every association, every hesitation, every perceived weakness became a risk to the survival of the crown in the modern world. And in that mindset, distance was not optional. It was necessary. That belief reportedly created tension at the highest level of the royal household. Because while William was thinking in terms of institutional survival, others were still navigating through the lens of personal history, loyalty, and long-standing relationships. And that clash of philosophies began to surface in quiet but noticeable ways. Queen Camilla, occupying a role built on resilience and continuity beside King Charles, found herself increasingly positioned at the center of disagreement over how far the monarchy should go in separating itself from controversial associations tied to the wider scandal environment. What one side saw as necessary protection of the crown, the other saw as unnecessary rupture of personal bonds. And neither side was willing to fully yield. Inside palace circles, tension began to build not through public confrontation, but through absence, silence, and recalculated proximity. Meetings became more structured, conversations more controlled, and decisions more centralized around the Wales household. At the same time, King Charles was facing a reality that no monarch ever fully prepares for. Not just ruling, but ruling under physical limitation. His health concerns changed the rhythm of the monarchy. What once could be managed personally now required delegation. What once could be delayed now required immediate decision-making support. And that support increasingly came from one direction. Prince William. The heir was no longer waiting in preparation. He was already functioning inside the system of governance, not officially above the king, but increasingly essential to how the institution operated day to day. And as that reality settled in, a new dynamic quietly formed. A dual-center monarchy, one symbolic, one operational, one traditional, one emerging, and the tension between them became the defining feature of this new royal era. Outside the palace, the public still saw continuity. Engagements continued, speeches were delivered, ceremonial duties were performed. But behind closed doors, insiders describe a monarchy operating under a far more modern logic. Efficiency over tradition, risk management over legacy preservation, accountability over emotional loyalty. And William was the clearest advocate of that shift. And still, the palace does not declare it. There is no official statement, no formal transition, no public acknowledgement that anything fundamental is changing, because a monarchy does not move like ordinary institutions. It evolves through silence, through adjustment, through pressure that builds until it can no longer be contained within old structures. And right now, Buckingham Palace is under that kind of pressure, not from outside alone, but from within. The scandal surrounding Prince Andrew may have triggered the latest wave of instability, but it did not create the deeper issue. It exposed it. A monarchy operating in a world that no longer gives the benefit of doubt, a public that demands transparency, a media environment that amplifies every misstep into global scrutiny within minutes, and a royal household still trying to balance ancient tradition with modern expectation. Inside that conflict, King Charles finds himself in a position few monarchs ever face so openly, a reign defined not by expansion, but by management of transition. Every decision he makes now carries a dual weight. What is right for the present crown, and what is necessary for the future crown? And those two answers are not always the same. His health concerns have only intensified that reality. They have not removed him from the throne, but they have changed the rhythm of authority, the pace of governance, the reliance on delegation. And that delegation has a focal point. Prince William. What once was preparation has become practice. What once was advisory has become operational. And what once was distant succession planning has become immediate responsibility sharing. But power inside a monarchy does not transfer cleanly. It shifts unevenly. It overlaps. It creates zones of influence rather than clear lines of authority. And that is exactly what is now unfolding inside the royal household. William is not replacing the king. He is functioning alongside him in an increasingly parallel structure, one rooted in tradition, one rooted in adaptation, and between them, a growing necessity to align or risk fragmentation. The Andrew scandal accelerated this alignment in ways no one fully anticipated, because it forced rapid decisions about reputational containment. It forced questions about institutional accountability. It forced the monarchy to respond not as a symbolic entity, but as a system under real-time pressure. And in that environment, William's approach became dominant in certain areas, direct, structured, uncompromising when it comes to reputational risk. To him, the monarchy cannot afford lingering ambiguity around scandal-linked associations or perceived weaknesses in judgment. Because in the modern age, perception is not secondary to reality. It becomes reality. And once perception shifts, institutions lose control of their narrative. That belief is what reportedly widened the gap between different approaches inside the palace. Where some still prioritize long-standing personal bonds and internal discretion, William prioritizes external credibility and public trust. And those two priorities do not always coexist peacefully. Queen Camilla's position became increasingly complex in that environment, not because of a single action, but because of the symbolic weight of association. In a system where optics matter as much as action, even long-standing friendships can become points of institutional tension when public scrutiny intensifies. And as a monarchy faced renewed pressure, those optics became harder to ignore. Within palace discussions, sources describe a growing divide between emotional loyalty and institutional strategy. between personal history and public responsibility, between what has always been done and what must now be done to preserve relevance. King Charles, positioned between these perspectives, becomes a balancing figure, the one trying to preserve unity while quietly acknowledging that the structure beneath him is already changing shape, and that shape is increasingly influenced by William, not through confrontation, but through presence, through involvement, through necessity, because every crisis requires leadership, and every leadership vacuum is filled by whoever is prepared to act. William has not declared authority. He has assumed responsibility in areas where responsibility cannot be delayed, and in monarchy, responsibility often becomes indistinguishable from authority. Kate Middleton's role in this evolving structure cannot be overlooked either. While William represents structural transformation, Kate represents continuity that still feels familiar to the public. Her presence stabilizes a perception of the monarchy during periods of internal uncertainty. She is not positioned as a disruptor, but as a connector between tradition and change, between public expectation and internal evolution, and that balance has made her an essential figure in maintaining institutional coherence during a period of quiet restructuring. But even stability has limits when the system itself is under pressure. As months pass, the palace becomes a place of constant recalibration. Every engagement carries additional scrutiny. Every absence carries speculation. Every statement is measured not only for content, but for implication. Because the monarchy is no longer judged only on what it says. It is judged on what it does not say. And silence, in this context, speaks loudly. Behind the scenes, discussions about the future structure of the monarchy are no longer hypothetical. They are practical. They involve workload distribution, public engagement strategy, institutional size, and the role of non-reigning family members in an era increasingly sensitive to privilege and accountability. William's vision for a streamlined monarchy gains relevance in this environment. Fewer working royals, clearer responsibilities, stronger alignment with public expectations, and an emphasis on merit, visibility, and controlled transparency. To supporters, it is survival strategy. To critics, it is erosion of tradition. But to William, it is simply adaptation, because institutions that do not adapt eventually collapse under the weight of relevance loss. And that belief continues to guide his increasing involvement in strategic decisions, not as rebellion, but as preparation. As the monarchy moves deeper into this transitional phase, King Charles remains a symbolic anchor, but William increasingly functions as the operational center. And that duality creates a monarchy that exists in two timelines at once, one looking backward, one already moving forward, and between them, tension that cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. Because even institutions built on continuity eventually reach moments where continuity itself must be redefined. The Andrews scandal acts as a catalyst in that process, but not its origin. It is simply the pressure point that forces long-developing changes into visibility. And visibility changes everything, because once the public sees a shift, it cannot be unseen. And once the institution acknowledges it indirectly through action, it becomes harder to reverse. Inside the palace, there is no official language for what is happening, no term that fully captures the reality of shared authority, accelerated succession planning, and evolving roles within the royal household. So instead, it is described in fragments: support, delegation, modernization, continuity planning. But beneath those words lies something more significant: a monarchy quietly restructuring itself while still performing stability. And as that process continues, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The future is no longer approaching the monarchy. The monarchy is already adjusting itself to the future. And at the center of that adjustment stands William, not waiting, not hesitating, but increasingly shaping the institution he will one day inherit, while it is still being governed by the man who currently wears a crown. And that overlap, that shared space between reign and succession, is where the most important decisions of this era are being made. Not in public, not in speeches, but in the quiet, controlled, and carefully guarded rooms of Buckingham Palace, where history is not announced. It is negotiated. And right now, that negotiation is still in progress, but its direction is becoming harder and harder to mistake. Forward, always forward, toward a monarchy that will not look exactly like the one before it, and toward a moment when transition is no longer hidden behind structure, but completed by it.